Thank you very much. Thank you, Ishaq. Thank you for the conference organizers. It's a pleasure to, it's my first time at the ERF conference, so it's a pleasure to be here. This is some work that is joint with my co-authors Anders Olfsgaard from the Stockholm School of Economics and Tarek Youssef, who is at Silitech. By the way, the institute where Anders works is the Stockholm Institute for Transition Economies, and it's interesting that some of us who kind of began our academic life writing about the post-socialist transition have now come to the more exciting, I think, transitions going on in the world, and in fact the institute at Stockholm is doing a little bit of the same. And so it's good to see in attendance many of the prominent names at the plenary sessions have been people who also did some groundbreaking work on the post-socialist transitions.
You wrote Generation in Waiting also. Not you.
Sorry.
Only
Sorry. Yes. So this is the motivating factor for our work can be linked to three very different sets or groups of individuals acting during and just after the Arab Spring uprising. Mohamed Bouazizi, Tunisia, Jihan Ibrahim, or Gigi of Egypt, and of course the tribal militias in Yemen. These are very different lives, groups and individuals that have taken very different actions when given space. And our motivation is to try to understand why it is that different groups undertake different types of political mobilization. So the overall question, the big question is, what is the relationship between socioeconomic status, political mobilization? What does that relationship tell us about the drivers of exclusion as well as political participation in the Arab countries? And finally, what does this evidence imply for more extreme forms of political participation, more extreme forms of political violence? So think of a continuum that goes from voting, anonymous voting from on the one hand, to collective political violence on the other, as being a continuum of various types of political action. Our question is to think about whether these are distinct modes of behavior or whether there is something continuous that explains the full range. What are the factors that mobilize individuals? What are the factors that lead individuals to become mobilized, and what is it that contributes to the type of behavior that they choose? Now, one of the puzzles, and there are many, but one of the puzzles is that often the groups that participate in acts of rebellion are the groups that remain ordinary bystanders when it comes to normal, ordinary political and civic life. We all think of a lot of the initial protest movements as characterized by youth participation. Of course, if you look at youth participation in voting since then, it has dropped significantly in these countries. So, in the literature, there are two broad sets of explanations. If I can summarize them very crudely, there are grievance-based explanations, which look at alienation, perceived injustices, aspirational gaps, relative or absolute deprivation. There are also more rationalist arguments that look at individuals' ability to process information, to assess opportunity, and what types of rewards they expect. Now, the evidence for both of these, I think, is mixed. The implications for political dissent. Obviously, we expect that perceptions of marginalization will increase demands for regime change. But what form do those demands take? That's the central question. Does it lead to anti-regime political activity, or does it lead to self-exclusion and perhaps potentially breed more extremist anti-regime resentments in the long term? Now, I'm not going to present the technicalities of this, but our approach is to use a signaling model in which citizens have private information about their discontent or support for the status quo. That information is very hard to communicate credibly to authorities. However, it can be signaled credibly with actions that are costly to the individuals who take them. And the costlier the action, the stronger the signal of discontent to the regime. Well, obviously different groups will face different personal costs of nonviolent political action. There are opportunity or time costs, there are risks to employment, status, etc., from retribution. You might expect that lower income cohorts would have stronger incentives to engage in nonviolent political action because of their presumed level of discontent. However, low-income cohorts, as we're going to argue, are limited to low-cost actions. Those are the signals that are the least credible, they're the least informative for regimes. So there's a simple cost-benefit calculation of nonviolent activity that we focus on, which is that the opportunity cost, the personal cost, is increasing as your socioeconomic status increases. But since lower personal costs are associated with weaker signaling, below a certain threshold, political actions are going to be non-credible. So if you think about it in a very simple graphic representation, we have increasing costs with socioeconomic status. Below a certain threshold, there is no benefit of political action. So that benefit kicks in after a certain threshold. As a result, the net benefit has this relationship. Depending on, and I will allow this cost to be non-linear, ultimately, because as many have pointed out, at the lowest income groups, the opportunity costs of political action can actually be quite high. So if you think about dividing up mobilization into high-cost mobilization and low-cost mobilization, what is low-cost mobilization? Low-cost mobilization you'd expect to be the province of lower status groups who face low opportunity costs of mobilization. They can send weaker signals of discontent. Despite their grievances, they may have less reason to mobilize. Even in the presence of strong anti-incumbent preferences, marginalized groups would be less likely to engage in anti-regime actions. Low opportunity costs of mobilization means that the choice is to self-exclude, because there are no credible non-violent signals that those groups have access to. High-cost mobilization. We then introduce an additional instrument of political action, which is violence, political violence. That is different. Violence carries a high risk of regime reprisals. It is a uniformly high-cost signal. Higher status cohorts don't have to resort to violent action because their opportunity cost is high enough so that they can credibly signal discontent through other sorts of actions. But members of lower status groups will, if they are sufficiently discontented. Finally, if lower status groups place a high value on regime change, they're going to support high-cost mobilization. So if you think about the costs of the cost of action that groups would take, middle upper class groups, you would expect that the threshold of discontent would be a little bit lower than for the poorer groups. The poorer groups, of course, would undertake higher cost actions, middle and upper class groups, lower cost actions. That's the summary of the model, which is more detailed in the paper. And as a result, in equilibrium, we expect different types of political actions depending on the level of discontent and on the personal opportunity cost. And so that's what we try to test empirically. I'm not going to go into all the details. We are relying essentially on the same set of survey data. We are focusing on the Arab world. So we do not look at the whole world. We look at the Arab world in order to maximize the survey evidence that's available. We have the Gallup survey, the World Value survey, the Arab Barometer. I will not go into the details of those. We try to use multiple dimensions to understand how status might be measured, both income measures as well as what's called the Cantrell scale, the self-anchoring Cantrell scale of where one is in the ladder of life. Now, grievances, of course, are intricately linked to some of those measures, but we also, of course, look at employment status, which in this region in particular is a sharp indicator, can be a sharp indicator of grievance. Finally, I just want to point out that in addition to all the other controls, we do attempt to control for bias. Now, obviously, individuals are all very different. Some of them are pessimistic, some of them are optimistic, some complain more, some complain less. We try to adjust for that individual, specific, systemic bias with a simple approach, which is simply take reported financial well-being, regress it on income, and take the residual. And that residual essentially explains, or is essentially the bias with regard to one's financial well-being that cannot be explained by income, which we think of as representative of individual systemic bias more broadly. And finally, we use both regular parametric but also some non-parametric analyses. Okay. There we go. Again, I'm not going to show any regression tables. I just wanted to show some very simple results. Political participation. This is just showing the effect of income or of the Cantrell scale on various types of political participation. Some of these are from the Gallup, some of these are from the Arab Barometer, and one is from the Arab Barometer, one's from World Values. These are questions of civic engagement, of civic volunteering, of whether individuals contact public officials, whether they attend political meetings, and then finally whether they have an interest in politics more generally. And you can see that the effects of income are all positive and fairly significant. However, as you increase the cost of action, the likelihood of reprisals, the likelihood of retribution, an interesting thing happens with the effect of income, which is that it declines and then it switches sides. So it goes from being positive when it comes to participating in boycotts, signing petitions, even demonstrating, weak, quite small, but positive. Once you're asking people whether they're willing to occupy buildings, engage in strikes, attack civilians, attack police, the effect of income switches. And now it's the lower income groups that are more likely to engage in those types of activities. So what's going on here? Well, what we're arguing is that, well, before I get to that, let me just say something about the most marginalized. The most vulnerable, the most marginalized might be discontent, but there is some reason to expect that their support is less expected for the government to buy off. And there are a variety of policy approaches and redistributive efforts in this part of the world that have been engaged in for that purpose. So beneficiaries at the lowest end of the income scale may perceive less discontent than those who are better off, but we would expect that at the lowest end of the income distribution, the time and effort needed to secure necessities of life are probably higher. And as a result, if this is the case, in equilibrium, we would expect a non-linear relationship between income levels or socioeconomic status on the one hand and the most extreme form of political engagement, support for violence. So that is something we try to test. We try to rely on more flexible models than your typical global regression approach. We are trying to examine the true functional form. All of our time's been cut, by the way, so you're wondering why we're kind of panicking at the end of our presentation. We are trying to examine the true functional form of the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. Obviously, there are lots of options. The most traditional one is some kind of locally weighted regression. However, that does not allow for controlling covariance, and there tends to be a lot of noise in that approach. So we rely on two different approaches just to make sure that we're not biasing our results one way. Again, I won't go into the details. One is a generalized additive model. The other is a fractional, multivariable, fractional polynomial approach. Okay, so this is just a table that shows the increases in deviance, which is just a measure of the worsening of fit if a parametric term is used. So in other words, this is the benefit from going non-parametric, right? So basically we have two surveys that ask questions about political violence. We have two measures of socioeconomic status controlling for all the covariates that I mentioned, And we had two approaches, generalized additive modeling and fractional polynomials, all of which show significant increases in non-parametric approaches to thinking about the relationship between socioeconomic status and political violence. And here is what I wanted to show you. In all cases, regardless of the survey and regardless of the type of scale you're using, if you notice the portion of the curve that is above zero, that is where there is a positive likelihood of engaging in political violence, is all in the second from the bottom quintile. Not the lowest quintile, not the upper quintiles.
Sorry, can you go back to that? Just what is that y-axis? Are those probabilities?
Those are probabilities. Those are partial residuals. So these are partial component plus partial residual plots.
In plain English, what is it?
This is the likelihood that at that level of income or at that level of satisfaction, you will engage in political violence, controlling for everything else that I mentioned we're controlling for. So if you look at the zero, above it means there's a positive likelihood of supporting violence. Below, there's a negative likelihood of supporting violence. That's it. Okay. All right. So just to summarize, in the Arab world, the poor, the uneducated, unmarried, and women are less civically engaged. All right? Those are the sort of static or the linear factors that we find, the factors that determine political engagement. Higher socioeconomic status generally translates into greater propensities to engage in ordinary political action. The poorest, on the other hand, are stuck with low-cost signals. It's possible that the very richest also would self-exclude, but not for the same reasons that the poorest would self-exclude, but because for them, the opportunity cost is so much higher than any benefit that they would get. Finally, last couple of points here, is that the poorest, vulnerable groups, in fact, what we find are, of course, the second to bottom quintile, for whom nonviolence represents weak signals, are also more likely to support political violence, but of course the threshold for grievances has to be quite high. Finally, the poorest, most marginalized, are likely to self-exclude. I'm going to end there because of time and turn it over to